Good morning and welcome to this New London Architecture webinar. I'm Simon Allison, Senior Inward Investment Manager at London & Partners, and I'm glad to be chair for today's event. London & Partners has developed with NLA an urban innovation programme that brings together the tech and built environment sector, connecting innovators, tech specialists, and urban practitioners to discuss how emerging technologies and practices could solve key urban problems. As well as examining the impact of technologies on London, it champions the role of London as an incubator for technological innovation in property and city making. London & Partners is the international trade, investment and promotional agency for London. We provide free, confidential and dedicated support to not only London-based startups and scale-ups, but also to international companies setting up here in the capital. Today's webinar looks at improving public services through data sharing. Collecting and effectively managing data is critical to deliver vital services for the city, from managing traffic to measuring air quality to monitoring energy consumption, to name a few. But what are the ways to create better collaboration across London using data? What are the frameworks and approaches that can be used to connect these services all up? Well, we have an amazing lineup of speakers today that will present some case studies and answer some of these questions. We will then have a panel discussion and also time for a Q&A from the floor afterwards. If you want to ask questions to our speakers, you can post your questions throughout the event using the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll try and answer as much as we can during the Q&A time. As mentioned before, this webinar is part of the NLA Urban Innovation Programme in association with London & Partners. I'd also like to thank the programme champions, Sharing Cities, and the London Legacy Development Corporation. Now I'm pleased to introduce Nathan Pearce, Head of the Smart London team and Sharing Cities Programme Director at the Greater London Authority, who will present the IoT framework developed by Sharing Cities and the London Office of Technology and Information. Nathan, over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Simon. Thank you to NLA for inviting me here today. As Simon said, my name is Nathan Pearce. I'm the Programme Director for Sharing Cities. And also I'm the head of the Smart London team at the Greater London Authority. And I'm here to talk to you today about the Internet of Things framework that we've developed jointly between Sharing Cities and the London Office of Technology and Innovation over this last year. It's nearly ready to be released there out into the wild. So we're very happy and proud to be able to show you this today. And really it's about how can we create a common approach for Internet of Things technology in London, which is all about data generation and data sharing and making the most out of the data that we get from such devices. Next slide, please. So just a very quick word on Sharing Cities, the programme that I've mentioned a couple of times now. This is a large European funded Horizon 2020 programme that is led by London and covers the cities of Milan in Italy and Lisbon in Portugal. And in London, it's the area of Greenwich, where we are testing 10 types of smart and digital technology, the same 10 types of technology in each of those three cities to see what works, see what commonalities there are, and to start to understand the benefits of what data this digital technology generates. And when I'm talking about Internet of Things technology in this respect, I'm talking about the sensors, the tech that can be adapted to infrastructure on the street that generates information, both about the infrastructure that it's attached to and the people that uses it, which is then relayed into a platform that can be used by city managers to improve services. So we have tested this over the last 5 years in Sharing Cities, and the London Office of Technology and Innovation is a group of 15 or 16, I can't remember the number, it's 15 or 16 London boroughs who collaborate with each other around innovation and technology in London. Next slide, please. So we came together, it was actually 2 weeks before the first lockdown, which seems like a complete world away now. We were shaking hands by touching elbows back then. And we came together for a week-long sprint event where we wanted to tackle the question that you can see in front of you on the slide here. How can we help London boroughs commission IoT with more confidence? How can we create something that's common, a common approach? We started from standards, but it's a bit more than just standards. And how can we start to reduce some of the barriers that boroughs face? And really, how can we help borough officers commission IoT with more confidence? Next slide, please. So first of all, in this sprint week, we came together. There was around about 200 or 300 people who were involved in this sprint week, and easily 30 or 40 people who were arriving each day to work on this specific challenge, and people from across a whole range of different areas. We had people from companies such as Microsoft, who we have here today as well, all the way to lots of SMEs and London boroughs. It was a really good mix of people who kind of came together in a kind of hackathon style sprint week approach. And the first thing we did was we had a look at, well, what is the user journey of borough officer when they come to commission IoT, understanding that actually very rarely does a borough officer in London commission IoT on its own. Actually, more often than not, it's part of a wider contract. It could be a lighting contract, it could be a care contract, it could be retrofitting buildings, and understanding how they come into contact with this new type of technology that generates data, and what kind of way they commission it currently, and what would be the ideal way of commissioning it in the future. Next slide, please. And then we also had to look at who else in the world has done this. You know, we aren't the first to think about creating some kind of framework for London. We had to look out there. New York has a really good guidelines for Internet of Things technology. So does Amsterdam, and we already had the GDS server standards in this country. So these are things that we could build on rather than starting from scratch. Next slide. So we spent a long time coming up with these three aspects of the framework, or principles of the framework, that you can see in front of you here. What we decided was that when it comes to commissioning IoT framework, IoT technology, we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing in the right way with the right technology. And I'm going to take you through these now. So next slide, please. So by doing the right thing, what we really mean as the Greater London Authority and London Office of Technology and Innovation is making sure that we're led by outcomes. I think one thing that came out of the Sharing Cities programme and also out of the Sprint Week is that where borough officers really struggle is when you start with the solution and try and retrofit it to your local area. Actually, you should be starting with the needs of your local area and then working towards a tech solution from that point. So next slide, please. So really, this is all about design. It's all about making sure that you follow the commissioning cycle, and it's always ensuring that you strive towards equitable outcomes for your residents wherever possible. And again, it's about avoiding just applying a solution to an area and doing things in the other way around. Next slide. So in terms of doing things in the right way, we have three areas that we identified. This is all about making sure that you co-design and collaborate, reducing barriers to collaboration and putting people at the heart of how you're designing your service, and then applying a technical or digital solution to that challenge. It's making sure that we are as ethical and as transparent as possible, particularly if you're going to be creating algorithms that make a decision on a service that someone is going to receive. We need clear lines of responsibility and open decision making. This is something that in general, the Chief Digital Officer of London is keen for us to explore more and more as we move forward in this area. And then the other area is about making sure that we protect people's privacy and follow GDPR. Next slide, please. And here, and all of this will be available publicly very, very soon. What we've done for each of these three principles is linked to a range of different guidance documents and pieces of advice, largely from government, but some of them are from European Union sources. Some of them are also from the G20 Global Smart Cities Alliance. And these are guides that can support a borough officer to navigate their way through topics such as data ethics and data transparency and so on. Next slide, please. And then the final principle is about doing things with the right technology. So we need to make sure that whatever technology we deploy that's collecting data about our citizens is safe and resilient, particularly in terms of cybersecurity. We need to really make sure that technology in London is compatible and consistent. And this, for me, in the big data area and data as a service is really, really important. It's no good if all of the boroughs go off, purchase lots of different types of technology that can't talk to each other or interact, or collect data in a way that can't be properly compared, or do things in such a way which are completely closed off from other boroughs. The value of data is in having a lot of it and being able to analyze it. And in London, that is through the London Data Store. So what we were looking at here was, what kind of common standards can we promote that enable interoperability, and how can we share learning across London? And then finally, how do we ensure that everything we do has a positive environmental impact? And we as an organisation for the Mayor are really keen to make sure we prioritise sustainable technology, particularly given the 2050 carbon reduction targets. So next slide, please. And again, this is linked here to lots of different existing bits of guidance that help you through these different areas. And what we're going to be looking at over the next year with London Office Technology and Innovation is where we feel some of this guidance isn't either strong enough for a London setting or needs a bit of interpretation for a London setting. We're going to be doing a bit more work over this next year to try and fill some of those gaps. Next slide, please. So very finally, when I was invited to give this talk today, I was also asked to give some thoughts about what is the role of Internet of Things technology in COVID recovery. And I think one of the things that has been really interesting about COVID is it hasn't particularly thrown up anything brand new, or it hasn't kind of forced us to do things that we weren't already doing. What it has done, it has massively accelerated some of the work that we were already implementing in London. So the need for sensors on the streets is now under much more of a microscope than it was before COVID pandemic. We have seen the rapid rollout of data sharing agreements across London, which previously was sluggish and took a long time to negotiate. Now, all of a sudden, we're doing them in a matter of days or a matter of weeks, particularly between agencies such as NHS, GLA, local authorities. It's heightened the need for big data. Track and trace works when you've got big data and large data sets. It doesn't work when things are fragmented. And I won't talk through all of these. You can read them up there. A lot of these are quite self-explanatory, but I think one thing that it has done in particular in London, which is very visible now, is and something that we're working on, is the change to the transport mix. I think this is something that is really visible in our city at the moment, and the increase in the use of public car, which is something that we really want to see if we can address. And finally, it's shifted our focus definitely towards resilience and how we can avoid similar kind of challenges in the future. Next slide, please, which I do believe is my last. Thank you very much. And back to you, Simon.
Thank you, Nathan. Fascinating. And of course, you're quite right about the acceleration across so many sectors, and hopefully we can touch on that in the questions a little bit later on. And now we're going to hear from Sarah Hayes, Senior Planner at Arup, about the concept of digital neighbourhood. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, Simon. Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. So next slide, please. So what I wanted to talk about today is Arup's work with the London Data Commission, and specifically the piece of work that we have done exploring the concept of digital neighbourhoods and what that means in a London context. So I want to touch on what we sort of mean by a digital neighbourhood, why it's an important concept, how it fits into the London Data Commission, and then I want to spend the bulk of the time talking about the 4 use cases that we developed up across London and looking at what their impact could be and what the future of those is. So I think when data can be quite an esoteric, intangible concept, and I think bringing the concept of place into our understanding of data by talking about it at a neighbourhood scale is a really powerful concept. When I talk about neighbourhoods, we often think about them in the planning world as this sort of quite tight core unit where there's the interaction of a community, in a lot of cases a developer that sort of owns or manages a big tranche of that land, and also the government interaction there. I think they're quite powerful units because that's really the scale at our cities. We have an understanding of what it feels like to be in a particular community, say Islington or Stratford. We don't necessarily engage with the concept of being in London or in the southeast. Or the neighbourhood is really that unit that we experience the city on. Next slide, please. So I think that becomes then the leverage that you can use to bring the digital overlay onto it. So if a neighbourhood is already the unit that we're experiencing and interacting with on a city, how do we bring that digital overlay to meet a particular need or a goal? So echoing what Nathan was saying before, I think it really needs to be outcomes driven. And so being able to define a problem, define the data and who holds it, and bring it together to be able to solve a particular problem that the community acknowledges and is aware of, I think is a really, really powerful concept. And that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about digital neighbourhoods. Fully aware that that can span quite a lot of things. So I just wanted to pull out a couple of examples that are happening around the world before we jump into the London context. So you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm Australian, so I've got an Australian example in here, which is a quite technical solution. There's a lot of really interesting work coming out of the Centre for Low Carbon Living in Australia at the moment, looking at digital twins, not just on a building level, but are taking that building information modelling systems and expanding that to a wider precinct or neighbourhood. And given the institute that's driving this, it's very much focused on carbon modelling and reducing carbon throughout the planning, construction, and then operation of a neighbourhood. Virtual Singapore is another example, but quite different again. So being developed to cover the whole of the Singapore city. This is a tool that takes data about planning applications, about wind tunnels, about heights, shadowing, all sorts of different data, with a real focus on really trying to get the community engaged on understanding what is happening in the city and what the plans are and how they can influence those and comment on them. So pushing the community engagement agenda to quite a new level in a data-driven way. That's sort of in the beta phases at the moment, I understand, and has been really well received so far. On the other end of the reception spectrum, I suppose, the Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, so the Google Alphabet project, which was, I think, as many of the audience might be aware, they've failed to get planning approval, which was something that happened over the last couple of months. And the commentary around that has been that it was very much trying to be everything to everybody, trying to bring lots of different, and they were doing some really great stuff, but I think they really hadn't tapped into what the need was in the community. And so in trying to be everything to everybody, they sort of spread themselves a little bit thin, and couldn't quite articulate what the value was of the digital overlay to the community they were trying to serve. So I think that highlights Nathan's point earlier about really making it outcomes focused and building backwards from there. Next slide, please. So how does this fit into London? So I work for ARUP, and ARUP was one of the conveners of the London Data Commission, which was a set of organisations, mainly from the private sector, but then also with involvement from the GLA, the TfL, and some other private sector, some other NGOs as well. So it was a really good cross-section of the London data community. And the aim there was to put together some recommendations about the future of data governance in London, with a specific focus on data sharing. So that sort of step beyond simply open data that can be used for public consumption in any shape or form, which London has been a world leader on, and moving into that slightly more difficult to manage data in the sharing space, where it might be slightly commercially sensitive, and so working out ways of sharing and governing that data in a way that's still able to unlock the value. Next slide, please. So Daniel, who's speaking later on this call, will talk more in detail about this. But the Commission put together some recommendations to move how data is governed in London forward. And one of those was to explore this idea of data challenges, and put them out to the community to ask for solutions for. Next slide, please. So the recommendations report one of those recommendations was that we explore these data challenges, and we wanted to really deliver on something tangible as we were going through this process. So in conjunction with working through the recommendations, we also started scoping up these 4 pilots, which would then become the data challenges. One of those was the digital neighbourhoods and trying to understand what that means for London. And ARIP's role in this was to develop 4 case studies with 4 different landowners in London. Next slide, please. So these were Brent Cross South, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, Mayfair, and Midtown Business Improvement District. It was quite an interesting cross-section because they're all very different. Mayfair is a Grosvenor portfolio piece. Brent Cross South is Argent related, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park is London Legacy Development Corporation, a mayoral development corporation, and then Midtown Improvement District is obviously a different beast again. So trying to work out how these neighbourhoods could use digital techniques or digital data sharing to solve particular problems that were pressing in their particular communities. And I'll go through these one by one. Next slide, please. So starting with Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, their real focus is mobility and how to leverage data to make the mobility offering in their park better. So as in their position as a mayoral development corporation, they have a huge remit to be able to, and have really strong reputation in trialing mobility technologies, and they've been trailblazers in a lot of different pilots and trials, from e-scooters to digital twins already, and they've been doing some really great work. So their challenge was how to think about bringing these together into sort of a cohesive offering, working towards a data-driven mass platform that really made their neighbourhood and their community feel engaged throughout the planning process of that, and then into the delivery. They see their park not just as the community that lives there, but also the halo, I suppose, of influence that we talked about earlier, the people that interact with it. So we started talking about using a subsection of the London data store as that sort of house for a lot of the data that's being generated, and using it as a way of something that can sit between the park and the people that use it. The other interesting thing about this one is that they want to, there's a really strong monitoring and baselining element, and being able to understand whether these mobility offerings then are able to drive up the value of car-free developments, and whether that can then be used as an example outside of the park and outside of London. Next slide, please. Mayfair's agenda was a very strong sustainability focus, and so together with them we talked about, or we developed this concept of sustainability in their neighbourhood as this 5-pillar approach: so water, energy, waste, biodiversity, and air quality. We worked with them to develop some concepts for what each of these metrics could be like, could be. And then also what a data sharing strategy between all of their tenants, Grosvenor and Westminster, the local authority, would look like. Again, a really strong baselining element in terms of trying to understand current performance. So then what would change would be measured across each of these indicators. Next slide, please. Brent Cross South took which was Lambeth, is a joint project between Lambeth Council and Argent related, is in northwest London and is really focused on that well-being and social value and inclusion element of the development. It's an interesting one, trying to start the community engagement early through a really strong digital engagement strategy, and then also guiding their development through planning and operation using data collected on social well-being metrics. They're quite keen to sit somewhere between the digital and physical realms. So being able to engage people not just through a web browser, but also in a physical space, giving them access to data through the physical realm. And then finally, next slide, please. Midtown bid. So in the centre of London, representing about 400 businesses, the Midtown Business Improvement District has committed publicly to working towards the 4 SDG Sustainable Development Goals pictured on the right here. So we talked with them about what that would mean, measuring and collecting data on these, making it available between businesses. This project spanned COVID hitting, so the focus changed quite quickly in terms of this building back better agenda. And they're quite a perfect conduit between the 400 businesses they represent and the GLA, who at the time was very keen to understand tenancy, occupancy, spend, those sort of data variables for their portfolio. So next slide, please. So those were 4 case studies in which we thought the concept of a digital neighbourhood meant 4 very different things in 4 very different places. And we developed and released a report on what these could look like going forwards. The report was released in September, and we're continuing to work with some of these partners and also with the GLA as they work towards some of the other recommendations that the London Data Commission has put forward. So I'd say it's still very early stages, but they're all looking very exciting. And I think the real benefit to London is being able to understand what tangibly, what outcomes these digital neighbourhoods could achieve for their communities. So yes, watch this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Obviously, so much there to digest. I could listen to Sarah for hours about what Arup are doing, and obviously lots of other businesses as well. And now into our last presentation from Lionel Vincent, Product Manager for Air Quality Solutions at Bosch. And Lionel is going to be talking about sharing air quality data. Lionel, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, NLA, for inviting me. Yeah. Next slide, please. I will today speak mainly about air quality and how we can share data of air quality with some example here you can see in London. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I know it's Black Friday. I will not speak of Bosch wash machine today, but mainly really what is the ecosystem for air quality. So this ecosystem, next slide, please, is quite complex, and it's always, the main focus is always around data. And the data is in the middle of this ecosystem. But you can see, as you see in the right side of the slide, there is a lot of different key influencers, key players. From one side, you have all the data provider which are connecting things. Bosch, for example, is providing this IMB, so this monitor with very accurate air quality data. But you have also the developers. These guys are mainly enhancing the data, and they are playing a key roles with a partner. Today we saw Sharing City, but there is a lot of other partners which have a big interest with this data. And finally, to the right side, for air quality, the local authority are also playing a big role. They can influence, and they can be influenced by industry, infrastructure, or transport. There is a huge amount of different parameters that can really influence for air quality. Bosch, from its side, they really try to focus on their value add and to focus on how to make the link in between this air quality and the emission of the pollutant. So we developed some very accurate model to really see all these parameters together and to bring all the stakeholders together. So I will say at the beginning, what is really important is to understand each stakeholders and to see what is the value add, what kind of data they can bring, what kind of know-how, expertise they have, and to make sure they have really a clear understanding of their scope. Next slide, please. So as soon as you know that, you have to define a common goal together. And I think you already speak about it today, but data as a business is always something everyone is keen to work on it, but it's also very complex because you have a lot of possibility. Everyone has his own expertise, his own know-how, but to have a full picture, to understand really all the different aspects, And to bring all these goals together is the most complicated part. So you really need to make sure the stakeholders understand this goal, understand the gain, the pain, and want to work together. And here you can see, for example, with air quality, you can play a role in very various different areas. You can adapt the traffic signalization according to air quality. You can change your road infrastructure. You can also enhance your smart infrastructure. And finally, you can promote active travel. So this is different domain, different activities, but all the stakeholders can really influence it. And that's why you need to make sure everyone finds his own gain, everyone understands what is the ecosystem and the value he wants to bring with it. Next slide, please. Here, I will go a little bit more in details about the data vision from Bosch. Sorry, it might not be so clear, and pardon my French, but data business is a mess. Here you can really see data will group a lot of key activities, either from connecting things side, but also from development of a platform to analytics and application, and finally the cloud and all the service behind this. So at the end, you have a lot of different activity, a lot of parameters, and how to make it concrete to bring it to a final project. And I think here you can see to the right, this is an example of the project we have in Brixton with some key partners. And you will have to focus first of which data you have an interest in. You will have to check what has the data available, what has format of the data. And here for this project, we really want to improve the traffic and to see how this traffic improvement change the air quality. So with a partner like TfL, but also the Land-based Council, we really had a look at what is the data available, how we can bring them together, and how we can adapt and enhance them. You see the picture on the right side. This data can be bring from a different point of view, and you have a lot of bunch of data. Then you have to focus on, okay, what kind of technology I want to use, what kind of technology I need to deal with to achieve this improvement of air quality. I will use an example for traffic. You can really see how many vehicles are running in the street. We're just counting it. There is some sales counter detector in the ground, and you can count it. But for air quality, what really matters is to understand the behavior of the driver. So you need not just to know how many cars are driving in and out, you need also to know where they're braking, where they're accelerating, because this is the biggest source of pollution. So for this reason, we decided to work with a partner, EA Technology, to use the floating car data and really to look at, okay, where are the braking area, where are the acceleration point, and make the traffic as smooth as possible and make sure the air quality at the end improve with changing either the traffic light or with making sure the lane, the bus lane are not blocking other traffic. So this is really important then to understand which technology you need to use and really to focus, should I use only the sales detector? Should I need also more data and more complex data? So if your goal is clear, if your aim is the same for every stakeholder, then the data will be able to be in the same format, to be also with the same interface and the same protocol of exchange. And that's here, you always need to keep it in mind for your data strategy to have always this kind of improvement, this kind of willingness to change your interface, to improve your data exchange, because the data will, in any case, always improve and always be bigger and bigger. Next slide, please. So at the end, you can see data business, as we saw here in Bosch, is not only just improving air quality, but it's also to have a win-win situation with the different stakeholders. And for that, you know that with data, you cannot directly have the right solution, have the right partner, you need to adapt continuously your data, enhance it. And for air quality, I will use an example. At the beginning of this project, we thought, okay, let's use the data, the floating car data only from here technology. But then with a partner, we thought, why not to use also the bus data? They are bringing a big influence. And why not in the future also to use the train data? Because all of these mobility solutions bring this impact and change the air quality. So here you need to rethink and to always be ready to adapt your technology, to adapt your solution if you want to have a win-win approach. I think that's it for me. And yeah, feel free to look at our website. You can have an example of what we did in Brixton. And here you can see our very accurate detector for air quality and one of our project managers.
Thank you, Lionel. Much appreciated. Just before we start the panel discussion, I might just like to take this opportunity to again remind our audience there'll be time for Q&A afterwards with all of our speakers. So please do submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function. So now we're going to move on to the panel discussion with our speakers, and I'd like to introduce a new panelist, Daniel Batts, who is Business Development Director at Microsoft UK. So welcome, Daniel. I'll come to you first, actually, Daniel, if I may. The London Data Commission, which Sarah touched on earlier, has done a lot of work in trying to solve some of the issues raised today about making better use of data and collaboration. With Microsoft's role as one of the delivery partners for the London Data Commission, can you give a brief overview of the aims of this proposal?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Yeah, absolutely. So as part of the London Data Commission and the conversations I've been having with City Hall and the London boroughs, Mayfair, NHS trusts, there's certainly growing recognition that to help address London's most pressing societal challenges, the capital does need to share and make better use of the vast amounts of data that is held in the many public sector organisations across London, as well as the many businesses in London. And in fact, from Microsoft's own research, we've established that we now live in a world where we generate more data in a single day than existed in recorded history up until the year 2000. So, you know, much of this data sits behind corporate walls or within layers of government, and 90% of it is never accessed for beneficial insight and understanding. So in the report, the London Data Commission recently launched at London Tech Week, we proposed a new data ecosystem for London, a framework, if you like, for managing London's data, promoting data collaboration, and bringing together all parts of London's public and private sector. And certainly the goal is to, if you like, banish the tyranny of data fragmentation that currently exists, and that was mentioned earlier. So we must try and promote collaboration and data sharing to generate actionable insights and lead to better policy making and outcomes that will, as I say, impact the lives of citizens across London and more broadly. And of course, this is even more critical in a post-COVID world. So the report identified 4 key recommendations. The first was to improve leadership for data in London through the formation of a London Data Board. The second, to establish a London Data Charter. The third, launching of data innovation challenges and proof of concepts that help solve the capital's biggest issues, and Sarah mentioned one of those earlier. And also find new ways to collaborate across London, as well as with other cities nationally and internationally, like the work Nathan has been championing, and that was mentioned earlier. So hopefully you can see it's super critical to create new data ecosystems that will build trust, harness new technologies, and provide a strong, coherent voice for stakeholders. So as I say, there were a number of pilots. Sarah mentioned one of them. We had a number of others. We had the digital inclusion pilot, which took data related to digital skills from multiple sources, both public and private, to provide deeper insights related to digital access in the London boroughs. And similarly with the electric vehicles charging pilot, we took data from various public and commercial sources to provide a better view of where perhaps best to place future new EV charging infrastructure in the capital. And then finally, the COVID business pilot repurposed work that actually we've been doing at Microsoft with the Alan Turing Institute on generating AI machine learning based air pollution heat maps and forecasting in London to switch to data related to business heat maps. So views on business can be generated from traffic cameras and or anonymized economic activity data from shops. So again, the policymakers can monitor the extent to which London is returning to normal. So clearly this requires a strong focus on governance, and we looked at this, and obviously, you know, related to ethics and privacy and security. But as Lionel highlighted, new innovation is making data sharing collaboration possible in a granular and highly controllable way. So certainly new state-of-the-art trusted data platforms and cloud technologies make it easier for users to define and control how data is collected, managed and accessed, you know, in a much more fine-grained way. And this will certainly ensure a win-win for all involved, both now and in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Very much appreciated. I might sort of bring in a couple of the other panelists. Of course, when we're talking about data, there are often concerns about sort of transparency on one side and privacy on the other. So what does the sort of panel think are the biggest challenges and opportunities to overcome these issues? Perhaps Nathan, if I could sort of come to you first on that particular topic.
I think, as I mentioned in the presentation around the IoT framework, these issues are really, really important for us. What I was talking about earlier was about the commissioning of specific kind of Internet of Things technology and infrastructure, but it's the same that cuts across, you know, all of the data spectrum, as it were, for what we work on. And at this moment in time, you may be aware of the London Data Store, which is our data sharing platform that we manage from the Greater London Authority. And currently they're looking at the redesign of that platform. It was first opened in 2010, so it's quite old now, and certainly it's outgrown its original scope. And they're looking at, you know, what is a data store for the future? How do we want it to run, and how are we going to utilize it to improve services for citizens? And those issues are at the very, very core of how it is now being redesigned and rethought of. And there's a lot of information out there that exists already, as I demonstrated in the framework. You know, government's done quite a lot of thinking, and there's quite a lot more coming out from government recently on security in particular. And I think there's a stronger steer now in terms of the ethics and privacy. But I think we've probably come to a point now where it's no longer good enough for a provider or a supplier to say, that decision has been made just because that's what the algorithm decided. I think we're getting to a point now where we need more transparency. We need to understand how decisions are made at the point where we're commissioning the service in the first place.
Yeah, and I think particularly if you're looking for that acceleration, which you mentioned earlier on, and to move at speed, obviously COVID-19 has accelerated quite a number of things as well. It's important that that's obviously transparency forms part of that as well. Just moving on to talking about sort of the whole fragmentation of data and the lack of access to different data sets held by different organizations. I think Daniel touched briefly on this in his conversation earlier. Obviously, that's one of the key barriers to making the best use of data to support better public services. I might be interested to ask sort of Sarah what her thoughts are about expanding on how this can be overcome in practical terms as well.
For sure, yeah. I think that's it's one of the huge challenges, and especially given that there are so many different actors in any given industry on any topic relating to data, making sure that the standards align so that we don't have that fragmentation is, I think, the really key challenge in moving forward to achieve any of the aims that any of the panelists have talked about today. So my background's sort of in transport, so I found it quite interesting throughout COVID, the role that the DFT has been playing in bringing together local authority data sets on travel behaviours and transport use over the last what has it been now, 8 months, IRIP's played, we've had a piece of work, a contract with the DFT to create a big data pipelining program of ingesting all of the different formats of public transport usage data and in a format that then is able to be synthesized up to the national level. And the amount of work that's had to go into that because of that data fragmentation is quite significant. So I think it is a real challenge. I think there needs to be really strong leadership at various levels, and I think the GLA is doing a fantastic job about this with the reimagining of the London data store. But I think it really does. I think there's a role to play for the London Data Commission and bringing those voices together. But I think that the strong leadership is the key on that, and setting out the standards and the schemas that can be used for various data sets.
That fits in very nicely with the first question we have from our audience. So thank you very much from Sarah Gallagher. I might sort of point this towards Daniel. So what data standards are you aligning to ensure various data sources can be brought together and understood and compared?
Yeah, so I think we and most of the industry are kind of aligning around, you know, the concept of open data standards. I think, you know, data comes in all sorts of forms, and I think what's critical is that, you know, certainly the IT industry should really kind of make sure that it has, you know, that it embraces the idea of open data, open APIs, so that data can be shared, you know, around different use cases. So certainly we're super supportive of that kind of open data movement. And really, you know, we are at a stage where, you know, most of the standards in terms of data that exist, you know, we can support and we can provide the sharing. So I don't think actually the challenge is really a technical one. I think as has already been highlighted, I think obviously people have concerns about the sovereignty of their data and the level of sharing of data. And I think people have taken quite a sort of simplistic view of, you know, about what data sharing means. So, you know, we're not in a position anymore where we have to kind of, if you like, open the front door to our data and allow, if you like, someone to go through that door and sort of jump right into the big swimming pool of data that any organization has. I think we can get much more nuanced about how that data is shared, and only kind of share specific elements of our data with other parties in a controlled manner that, if you like, meets the security and privacy principles around a particular use case. So I think, you know, I think the art of the possible in terms of what we can do now is substantial, and I think as Sarah and Nathan have already said, you know, this is more around sort of the leadership, the culture, the trust that is required to actually make this happen and sort of take this forward.
Thank you. I mean, that's always fascinating, particularly around the security question as well. As more and more data becomes available, are we going to be ensured that it's going to be secure? And of course, that brings on, in a way, to sort of innovation as well. And I think Lionel touched on it, particularly the work that Bosch were doing with TfL about understanding the technology that you need, particularly the point about the braking and accelerating. People don't really think about that until they think about that. That's obviously the most of the times where the pollution comes in. So, I mean, I might ask you, Lionel, what are the conditions to enable innovation within the public sector? And what is the role of the public-private partnerships in supporting that process, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah, good question. So that's a very tricky point, because private and public has always their own opinion and own standards, and we say, and that's why I agree with your point, Daniel, and it's really to focus on leadership also. So the role really for the data in air quality is to bring a value add at the end for the final user. And if you make sure the final user has his security and privacy safe, you can really help him to change his behavior. And the local authorities, they don't want to, let's say, stop the vehicle access to some city, or they don't want to make the travel more complicated. They just want to improve the air quality for everyone. And for that, this data must be really helpful for everyone. And that's here the most complicated, is to be able to share the right data without bringing the privacy. And we can see, for example, for the braking or accelerating data, they are always anonymous, so we don't know which car is it from who. But at the end, it's really helping us with our know-how of engine and know-how of mobility solution in Bosch. We can really understand, okay, here in these areas, this neighborhood, you have an issue, and it might be good for everyone, either the guy in this car, but also the guy walking around.
Thank you, Dina. I mean, we're in terms of sort of transport as well, we're about to see, probably not until the spring, the London e-scooter trial, DFT. So in terms of data and pulling that together, I think we're going to, and obviously London has put together quite a compelling sort of tender document. So we look forward to seeing who obviously win those. That won't be announced for a while yet, but obviously that's going to change quite a lot of things, particularly around air quality as well. And obviously it's been trialed already in a number of cities around the UK. So I think a lot of people will be looking towards that as well. Quick question for Nathan, actually, from Andrew Parsons. Is Nathan about to share what the 10 sensors are that are being trialed in Greenwich? Thank you.
Well, I will, and I will be doing it in past tense because we're near the end of this project, and most of these technologies, and in all sensors, it's a range of different types of technology in sharing cities, but it's given us such a kind of rich knowledge of how these things work. And interesting what Sarah was talking about in terms of a smart data neighborhood. This was very much a smart city infrastructure neighborhood in Greenwich. So the types of technology that we deployed there was a suite of electric mobility solutions, so things like smart parking sensors, parking apps, electric charging points, both from lampposts and standalone electric charging points, electric shared vehicles. We replaced lots of the municipal vehicles with electric ones. In the Lisbon project, we replaced all 180 of their petrol vehicles with electric ones. So they really did sort of race ahead. We tested e-bikes. So a whole range of different electric mobility solutions and the data that generates. We tested data platforms. In London, we built capability into the London data store. We retrofitted hundreds of hundreds of flats inside buildings, both public and private, in Greenwich and the other cities as well. Lots of lampposts, lots and lots of smart lampposts with every kind of sensor and gadget you can imagine. We trialed and tested in one shape or form. Have I missed anything out there? Yeah, I think that kind of covers. Oh yes, citizen engagement applications. Yeah. We did a lot of that. And as I mentioned earlier, it was a 5-year project, and we're nearing the end of it now. So we're in that period of time where we're capturing the learning and thinking about how do you roll this out across London, what worked, and what kind of uses can we get out of this data, and what has that taught us about data sharing, because it was delivered by a partnership of public sector organisations, private sector organisations, and a group we haven't mentioned that much, academic institutions as well, and community groups who all came together and created this technology together, and the data sharing agreements that went along with it.
And thank you, Nathan. And of course, collaboration is at the heart of most things when they get done and when they're successful. And of course, those sort of outcomes driven, I think everyone's pretty much mentioned that today as well. But yeah, it's going to be exciting to see what the learnings are, and obviously when they're sort of published. But it's been a Herculean task, I have to say, over the last sort of 4 years, 4 or 5 years putting that together. Question for Sarah. Did you work directly with the local authorities for developing the 4 pilot projects you mentioned? Who were the key partners for the digital neighbourhoods? And if you worked with boroughs, which departments did you engage with? There's quite a lot there to answer. But,
well, it's quite a simple answer. No, for this stage of the project, no, we didn't work with the councils or the boroughs. We were engaging directly with the landowners or managers. So the 4 examples that I showed, Brent Cross South is managed by Argent Related. Midtown Business Innovation District is obviously a consortium of the 400 businesses that it represents. With the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, that was we engaged with the London Legacy Development Corporation, and then finally with Mayfair, that's a Grovester portfolio piece. So in developing up the concept pieces, that they were who we worked with, and they've been included in the recommendations report as things to pursue as part of the data innovation challenges that we're hoping that will become part of the GLA's new data approach. In which case, that's obviously the obvious next step is to start engaging more broadly with the public sector as well.
Thank you, thank you. Time for a couple more questions. I wish it went on longer, but we only have an hour, unfortunately. Speakers have touched briefly about the issue of technological obsolescence and resilience. Can the panel expand more on this topic, particularly what it means for public sector bodies that need to make decisions on which platforms and technology to adopt? Perhaps I can sort of aim that at Nathan and then come back to Daniel on that as well. So if I could start with Nathan first.
Sorry, I'm on mute there. It's really hard because obviously it involves a little bit of kind of future gazing and being able to identify what is right and what isn't. But I think, you know, one thing that I can comment on here is the importance of this issue and the growing importance of this issue over the next couple of years. You know, all of us who looked at the spending review announcement the other day and some of the quite eye-watering numbers that there are in terms of public borrowing and potential savings that we'll need to make means that, you know, local authorities, certainly London boroughs, are looking more and more now at technological solutions for how they can start to meet some of those savings, particularly things like remote asset management and various kind of technological issues like this. So it's really difficult. The Holy Grail at the moment are those business models where you can prove the value of a technology over 10 years and that it has a return on investment and it will generate savings and it will give you outcomes, etc., etc. Unfortunately, those, you know, watertight business models don't always exist at the moment. So it's partly the role of programs like Sharing Cities and innovation hubs and the work that Sarah's been doing in districts, where we can actually test some of these kind of technologies and approaches and see if they work and build up the business models. But yeah, it is a challenge. But I think if we can start to build it into people's thinking at the commissioning stage, then at least that can help us to start preparing for potential future obsolescence.
Thank you, Nathan. And Daniel, will be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, Nathan's absolutely spot on. I mean, in terms of, you know, moving, you know, if you like, from legacy to the future, then, you know, being able to look at ways of sort of mitigating the risk of adopting new technologies is really important. And certainly a lot of the work that Nathan's been doing absolutely does that. And certainly, you know, we're talking, you know, at the highest levels in government, in the Cabinet Office and with public sector customers around legacy, and you know, we have, you know, lots of capability along with a huge number of partners in our ecosystem in terms of helping customers, you know, on that journey to the cloud and to drive digital transformation. And certainly, you know, COVID has sort of accelerated that. You know, we're seeing people, you know, move much more quickly. But as I say, I think, you know, the key is to really kind of try and work and collaborate together on testing these new technologies. So we've talked a lot this morning about IoT. Again, you know, we have the ability to be able to consume and work with, you know, a vast array of IoT solutions for many different companies and organizations, and Bosch, who you've heard talk to. You know, again, we have good relationships with Bosch and many other companies. So I think the again, as I said earlier, perhaps, you know, it's not necessarily the technology that is kind of holding things back here. It's about, as Nathan said, you know, being able to develop a strong business case and be able to identify the value, and thus, you know, kind of reduce the costs of running the business and delivering services to citizens.
Thank you, Daniel. I think sadly we've come up to time, but of course we've been talking about accelerating technologies, building trust, collaborating, community, the importance of community and the role of the citizen and the future of data and how we lead an outcomes-driven solutions as well. I mean, I'd like to thank all our speakers, and of course thanks to our audience for watching. Just before the audience go, we'll now ask a minute of your time to respond to few questions with a poll, really about your experience of watching, so we can always looking to improve the program. But thank you very much indeed to all of you for your time, and I look forward to continuing this conversation as we go on. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.